Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into the incredible, odds-defying life of John Bunyan. Just imagine this for a second. An uneducated metalworker, a guy who literally fixed pots and pans to make a living, rises up to write a book that is historically second only to the Bible in its influence on Christian readers worldwide. I mean, wow. It's an epic story packed with rebellion, long imprisonment, just absolutely profound faith, and unexpected literary genius. Let's get into it. So, here is our roadmap for today's journey. We're going to track his life from being an ordinary tinkerer to defying the crown, getting imprisoned for 12 years, writing the Pilgrim's Progress, and finally leaving an extraordinary legacy. Section 1, an ordinary tinker. We're starting right at his very humble beginnings in Elstow, England, back in November 1628. What's wild to think about is the stark contrast between how he started and how he finished. Bunyan had barely any education. He actually had to drop out of school just to help support his family. He took up his dad's trade as a tinker. Basically, he was a traveling blue-collar craftsman repairing everyday metalware. Pots, pans, kettles. Grueling work. But against literally all expectations of 17th century society, this poor pot repairer becomes a cultural giant. He turns into a master theologian and a massive best-selling author. So how in the world did that transformation happen? Well, as a young guy, Bunyan openly admitted he struggled with some pretty bad habits and honestly couldn't care less about spiritual things. He even served as a soldier in the parliamentary army during the English Civil War. But after the war, he gets married. They were incredibly poor, but his wife brought 2 Christian books with her. And those books, they sparked something huge in him. He went through this intense season of inner turmoil, like a real-life city of destruction, just filled with overwhelming guilt and fear about his salvation. Ultimately, poring over the Bible and getting some patient guidance from local believers in Bedford led to a deep, personal conversion. And man, that changed absolutely everything. Moving on to Section 2, Defying the Crown. Let's see how this massive spiritual awakening put him on a direct collision course with the law. Looking at the timeline of his life, from his birth in 1628 and his soldier days in the 1640s, things really come to a head in 1660. That was a huge pivot point in English history. The monarchy was restored, and suddenly, the new government mandated that all ministers had to get official state approval before they could preach. For Bunyan, who was drawing massive crowds because he spoke in a gritty, passionate way that ordinary folks just loved, this new role was a gigantic problem. The crucial takeaway here is that Bunyan flat out refused to stop preaching. He believed, down to his very bones, that God, not the government, called him to proclaim the gospel. Sure, he didn't have some fancy university degree, but his messages were anchored in scripture, and he was absolutely not going to let the state silence him. But as you can guess, directly defying the crown in 1660 was an incredibly dangerous game to play. Section 3. Imprisoned for 12 years. That defiance triggered his ultimate ordeal, leading him straight to a grim, damp cell in Bedford County Jail. 12. He spent roughly 12 years locked away. Just try to wrap your head around that for a second. Simply for refusing to stop preaching to everyday citizens, Bunyan lost over a decade of his life. It was a real-world giant despair full of miserable, isolating conditions. But the deepest tragedy of being locked up wasn't the terrible physical conditions. It was the agonizing separation from his family. Bunyan had a wife and kids at home who desperately depended on him. He was especially heartbroken over his beloved blind daughter, Mary. Knowing his family was practically starving on the outside, Bunyan spent endless days in that dark cell making shoelaces, just to scrape together whatever pennies he could to keep them fed. Now, look at how he responded to this crisis. Instead of just crumbling under the weight of all that despair, he used this dark season with incredible purpose. First, it was about basic survival, making those shoelaces. Second, since he couldn't preach to the crowds anymore, he started ministering to his fellow prisoners right there in the jail. And third, he turned to writing and praying. Stripped of his actual pulpit, his pen became his megaphone. He was quite literally setting the stage for history. That brings us to Section 4, the Pilgrim's Progress. Let's dive into the absolute masterpiece that was born right on the floor of that prison cell. To really grasp Bunyan's genius here, we have to talk about Allegory. Basically, an allegory is a story where the characters and events are symbols that stand for much deeper truths. Bunyan didn't want to write some dry, academic theology textbook. He wanted to explain really complex biblical truths in a way that everyday folks, the farmers, the blacksmiths, the other tinkers, could totally understand and actually visualize. And the way he did it was by creating this unforgettable cast of characters and places. The story follows our main guy, Christian, on this perilous journey from the city of destruction all the way to the celestial city. Along the way, he isn't just wrestling with abstract concepts in his head. He's meeting actual characters named Faithful, Hopeful, and Evangelist. He gets trapped by giant despair. He gets lured into the chaotic Vanity Fair. Bunyan brilliantly turned the internal struggle of faith, temptation, and salvation into an epic, page-turning adventure. Now, while The Pilgrim's Progress, which was published in 1678, is the book that completely changed the world, becoming one of the most widely published and translated books in the English language, get this, he actually wrote over 50 books in total. 50. That includes other massive, heavy-hitting works like his autobiography, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners, and another really intricate allegory called The Holy War. Finally, Section 5, An Extraordinary Legacy. Let's see how this incredible pilgrim's journey finally comes to an end. After eventually getting released from prison, Bunyan jumped back into his calling with even more fire, pastoring a Baptist church in Bedford and preaching to thousands all across England. His death on August 31st, 1688, at 59 years old, was honestly incredibly poetic. He didn't die in a cell and he didn't die in a battle. He caught a fatal illness after riding horseback through a torrential downpour. And why was he out in that heavy rain? He was traveling to reconcile two friends who had fallen out. His literal final act was one of peacemaking. His joyful approach to theology is perfectly captured in a very famous little rhyme of his. It goes like this: "Run, John, run, the law commands, but gives us neither feet nor hands. Far better news the gospel brings, it bids us fly and gives us wings." That right there perfectly sums up his focus on liberating grace. He totally understood that impossible religious laws just weigh us down, but true grace, that gives us the power to soar. There's another really profound thought of his I want to highlight. He said, "In prayer, it is better to have a heart without words than words without a heart." That just perfectly captures his whole belief in sincere, authentic devotion. He wasn't interested in fancy religious rituals or elite academic phrasing. He just cared about the honest, raw posture of the human heart. So, bringing this all together, the crucial takeaway is this. A man buried in Bunhill Fields who had absolutely zero formal schooling left behind a staggering legacy. He authored a historical masterpiece. He endured 12 years of persecution without ever compromising his calling. He preached clearly to everyday citizens, elevating their understanding. And above all, he proved that God uses the uneducated, the ordinary, and the marginalized to accomplish the truly extraordinary. His writings are literally still strengthening believers globally, centuries later. As we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought about your own journey. If an uneducated tinker could change the world and pen an absolute masterpiece from the damp, dark floor of a prison cell, what might your greatest hardships be preparing you to achieve? Thanks for hanging out with me today, and keep exploring.